Welcome to the world of psychological research, where the only thing more confusing than our theories are the methods we use them. In this video, we will talk about selecting a research approach, and in the process of doing so, we will be looking at philosophical worldviews, research designs, and methods that are associated with these approaches. We are going to talk about this thing so that you can make an informed decision about how you want to go about your project. So, research approach are plans and methods for doing research. They include everything from general assumptions to specific ways to collect, analyze, and interpret data. This plan involves making a number of choices, and they don't have to be made in the order that makes sense to me or in the order that I will be showing here today. So the big decision is how to study a topic. This choice should be based on the philosophical assumption that the researcher brings into the study, the method of inquiry, which we will call as research design, and the specific research methods for gathering, analyzing, and interpreting data. The choice of a research method is also based in the type of research problem or issue being studied, the personal experiences of the researchers, and the people who will be reading the study. So, in this lesson, we will talk about uh, the three different ways of doing research: qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. So most of the time, the difference between qualitative research and quantitative research is framed in terms of using words as for qualitative rather than numbers as for quantitative, or using close-ended questions for quantitative hypothesis rather than open-ended questions for qualitative interview questions. But the truth is that that basic philosophical assumptions researchers bring into the study, the type of research strategy used in the study, like quantitative experiments or qualitative case studies, and the specific methods used to carry out these strategies are way better, are better way rather to see the difference between quantitative and qualitative researches. Now, both approach have changed over time, with quantitative approaches being more popular way to do research in the social science from the end of the 1800s to the middle of the 1900s. However, towards the end of the 20th century, people became more interested in qualitative research as the need for research grew. Mixed method research grew along with it. Now, qualitative research is a way to find out and understand what a social or human problem means to different people or groups. In the process of research, new questions and methods arise. Data are usually collected in the setting of the participants. Data are analyzed in a way that builds from specific to general themes, and the researcher decides what the data mean. The structure of the final written report can be changed too. People who do this kinds of research support an approach to research that values an inductive, a focus on individual meaning and uh, and the importance of showing how complicated a situation is. On the other hand, there is quantitative research, which is a way to test objective theories by looking at how different variables relate with one another. These variables can be measured usually with an instrument so that statistical methods can be used to look at the numbers. The structure of the final written report is set. It has an introduction, literature and theory, methods, research, and a discussion. Now, people who do this type of research have the same assumptions as qualitative research researchers about testing theories deductively, building in protections against bias, controlling for other possible explanations, and being able to generalize and replicate the results. And then there is mixed methods research. Now, mixed methods research is a way to do research that involves collecting both quantitative and qualitative data, combining the two types of data, and using different designs that may be based on philosophical assumptions and theoretical frameworks. Now, the main idea behind this type of research is that by using both qualitative and quantitative methods together gives a fuller picture of a research problem than either method alone. So, two important components in each definition are the approach to research involves philosophical assumptions as well as distinct methods or procedures. Now, the broad research approach is the plan or, as I have said earlier, proposal to conduct research involves the intersection of philosophy, research design, and specific methods. Now, even though philosophical ideas are often hidden in research, they still affect how research is done and need to be found. I think that people who are making a research plan or proposal should be clear about the larger philosophical ideas they support. This information will help them explain why they chose to do their research in a qualitative, quantitative, or mixed way. Now, in a proposal about worldviews, there could be a section that talks about the following: the philosophical worldview that puts forward in the study, a summary of the main ideas of that worldview, um, how that worldview affected how they did their research. Now, the term worldview is defined as a core set of beliefs that influence action. Now, paradigms, epistemologies, and ontologies, or broad research techniques. Now, worldviews are a researcher's philosophy and research approach. Discipline orientations, students' advisors or mentors, and past research experience shape our worldview. Now, these variables often lead researchers to use qualitative, quantitative, or blended approaches. Now, there are four worldviews or beliefs researchers bring to research: positivism, constructionism, transformative, and pragmaticism. Now, we will be talking about each of these approaches here, or each of these philosophical worldviews here. Now, traditional research has been based on post-positivist assumptions, which are more true for quantitative research than for qualitative research. Some people call this way of looking at the world the scientific method, or doing science research. It's also called post-positivism, empirical science, positivist, post-positivism research. Now, the last term is called post-positivism because it's the thinking that came after positivism. It challenges the traditional idea of the absolute truth of knowledge and recognizes that we can't be sure of our claims of knowledge when studying human behaviors and actions. Now, the post-positivist tradition come from writers in the 19th century like Comte, Mill, Durkheim, Newton, and Locke, as well as more recent writers like Phillips and Burbules. Now, post-positivism have a philosophy called determinism, which says that causes, or probably no, yes, causes decide what effect or outcomes happen. So the problem that post-positivists study come from the need to find and evaluate the factors that affect results, like those found in experiments. It's also reductionist in nature because the goal is to narrow down the idea to a small testable set, like the variable that makes up hypotheses and research questions. Now, post-positivists believe that knowledge comes from carefully observing and measuring the objective reality that exists somewhere out there in the world. So for post-positivists, it's very important to make numerical measurements of observations and study how people act. Lastly, the world is run by laws or theories that need to be tested, confirmed, and improved so that we can understand it. So, in the scientific method, which most positivists agree to, is the best way to do research. A researcher starts with a theory, gathers data that either supports or disproves this theory, and then makes any changes and tests that are needed. Now, the most important ideas behind this point of view involve all knowledge is based on guesses, and there is no such thing as absolute truth. So, evidence found through research is always not perfect and can be wrong. And because of this, researchers say that they don't prove a hypothesis. Instead, they show that the hypothesis wasn't rejected. Number two, research is the process of making claims and then changing or dropping some of them in favor of claims that are better supported. For example, more quantitative research start by testing a theory. Number three, knowledge is shaped by facts, evidence, and logical considerations. So in practice, the researcher gets information from the measure that the participants fill out or from the observations that the researcher writes down. Now, the goal of research, according to this point of view, is to come up with relevant, true statements that can help explain the problem or describe the important causal relationship between variables. In quantitative studies, researchers try to figure out how different variables relate to each other. So they do this by coming up with questions or hypotheses. Now, lastly, it is believed that being objective is an important part of doing good research. Researchers must look for biases in their methods and conclusions. For example, in quantitative research, it's important to have standards for validity and reliability. Now, others have a different view of the world. One such point of view is constructivism or social constructivism, which is often combined with interpretative and is usually seen as a way to do qualitative research. Now, the idea came from Mannheim and books like The Social Construction of Reality by Berger and Luckman, and Naturalistic Inquiry by Lincoln and Guba. Now, Lincoln and his colleagues, Mertens and Crotty, among others, have recently summed up this point of view. Now, they said that social constructivists think that people try to figure out how the world they live in and work in works. People make their own meaning out of their experiences, which are usually about certain things. Because these meanings are different and many, the researcher has to look for the complexity of views instead of trying to fit them into a few categories or ideas. The goal of the research is to deepen as much as possible on what people being studied think about the situation. Now, the questions in this kinds of research get more broad and general so that the people taking part can figure out what's going on, which usually happens through conversations or interactions with people. Now, the more open-ended the questions are, the better because the researchers want to hear what people say and do in their everyday lives. Most of the time, the person, or rather these personal meetings, are negotiated on a social and historical event. They are not simply imprinted on individuals, but are formed through interaction with others, and through historical and cultural norms that operate in individuals' lives. So, constructivist researchers often look at how people interact with each other. So, they also pay attention to the specific places where people live and work in order to learn about their history and culture. Researchers know how their own personal, cultural, and historical experiences affect how they interpret what they find. So they position themselves in their research to show how their interpretations are shaped by their own backgrounds. Now, the goal of the researcher here is to make sense or interpret how people, or rather, how other people see the world. Instead of starting with a theory, as in post-positivism, researchers come up with a theory or pattern of meaning on their own or develop it through induction. For example, Crotty in 1998 talked about constructivism. So he listed several assumptions under this worldview. He said that people make sense of the world by figuring out what it means as they interact with. And most of the time, open-ended questions are used in qualitative research so that the people taking part can talk about their thoughts. Number two is that human interacts with their world and try to make sense of it based on their history and culture. So we are all born into a world with meanings that our culture gives us. So qualitative researchers try to learn about the setting or context of the participants by going to setting and getting information there. They also try to make sense of what they find, which is based on their own experiences and backgrounds. Number three is that meanings are always made through interaction with people. And this interaction is always social. Qualitative research is mostly based on induction. The researcher makes sense of the data gathered in the field. Now, another group of researchers hold to the philosophical assumptions of the transformative approach. Now, in the 1980s and the 1990s, people who felt that the post-positivist assumptions imposed structural laws and theories that didn't fit marginalized people in other societies, or issues of power and social justice, discrimination and oppression that needed to be fixed came up with this view. Now, the worldview is not defined by a single body of research, but it does include critical theorists, participatory action researchers, Marxists, feminists, racial and ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, indigenous and post-colonial peoples, and lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transsexual, and queer people. So, the works of Karl Marx, Adorno, Marcuse, um, Habermas, and Freire have been used by transformative writers in the past. And for this point of view, you can also read in 1987, Heron and Reason in 1997, and Chemis and Wilkinson in 1998. Now, most of these researchers or authors who ask questions throughout the constructivist point of view didn't go far in calling for an action plan to help people on the margins. The transformative worldview says that research need to be linked to politics and a plan for political change in order to fight social oppression whenever or wherever it happens. So the research includes an action plan to reform that could be changed, uh, or rather, to reform that could change the lives of people who took part. the places where people work or live, and the researcher's own life. Also, there are important social issues of the day that need to be dealt with, such as empowerment, inequality, oppression, dominance, oppression, and alienation. Now, most of the time, the researchers with this point of view start with one of these questions as the main point of the study. This research also assumes that the person doing the inquiry will work with the participants so that the inquiry doesn't make the participants feel even less important. In this way, uh, the people who take part in the research may help come up with questions, gather data, analyze information, or benefit from the research. Now, transformative research give these people a voice, raising their awareness or pushing for change that will make their lives better. It becomes a single voice for change and reform. Now, this philosophical worldview focuses on the need of groups and people in our society who may be outside or who don't have a lot of power. So philosophical assumptions can be combined with feminist perspectives, racialized discourses, critical theory, queer theory, and disability theory. Theoretical lenses that will be talked about later on as we build a picture of these issues being looked at. So it puts the study of the lives and experiences of different groups that have been left out of the spotlight in the center. Of particular interest for these different groups is how their lives have been limited by, let's say, oppression and what they think they want to do to resist, challenge, or subvert these limitations. When studying these different groups, the researchers focus on inequalities based on gender, race, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic class that lead to unequal power relationships. Lastly, we have pragmatism. Now, the pragmatists have another point of view about worldview. The works of Peirce, James, Mead, and Dewey led to the idea of pragmatism. There are many different kinds of this philosophy, but for many, pragmatism is a worldview, or rather, as a worldview, comes from actions, situations, and results instead of conditions that came before, as in post-positivism. Now, people are interested in application, that is what works, and how to solve problems. So instead of focusing on methods, researchers focus on research problems and use all available methods to try to understand it. As a philosophical basis for mixed method studies, Morgan in 2007 and Patton in 1999 um, show how important it is to focus on the research problem in social science research and then use different methods to learn about the problem. Now, the key here is to understand that pragmatism doesn't believe in just one way of thinking about life and the world. This is true of mixed method research, in which researchers freely use both quantitative and qualitative assumptions in their work. Researchers have the freedom to choose how they want to do their research. And in this way, researchers are free to choose their methods, techniques, and procedures that best meet their needs and goals. In the same way, researchers who use mixed methods don't just choose one method like qualitative or quantitative for collecting and analyzing data. Instead, they use more than one method. It is not based on the idea that reality is either outside or inside the mind. So in mixed method research, researchers use both quantitative and qualitative data to help them understand a research problem as well as possible as well as possible. So pragmatist researchers decide what and how to research based on what they want to get out of it or where they want it to lead. Now, researchers who use both quantitative and qualitative methods need to come up with a reason why they need to uh, be combined in the first place. So now that we have looked into the philosophical worldview that underpins these research approaches, let's now look at research design and method. Now, the researcher not only selects a qualitative, quantitative, or mixed method to conduct, they also have to decide on a sort of study within these alternatives or within these three alternatives. Research designs are types of inquiry within qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methodologies, techniques that provide specific direction or procedure in a research design. Others have called them techniques or inquiry. So the designs available to the researchers have grown over the years as computer technologies have advanced our data analysis and ability to interpret complicated models. And as individuals have defined new methodologies for conducting social science research. In here, we summarize the research design in each of the research approaches that we have talked about. Note that instead of saying losses on the third uh, cell, this should be mixed method. Okay, so let's first start with quantitative research. Now, during the late 19th and throughout the 20th century, methodologies of inquiries linked with quantitative research were those that involved the post-positivist worldview, as mentioned earlier, that came predominantly in psychology. This include actual experiments and the less stringent experiment called quasi-experiments. An additional experimental design is applied behavioral analysis or single subject experiments in which an experimental treatment is provided over time to a single individual or a small group of individuals. So one sort of non-experimental quantitative research is causal comparative research, in which the investigator compares two or more groups in terms of a cause uh, or an independent variable that has already happened. Another non-experimental style of study is the correlational design, in which investigators utilize the correlational statistic to define and assess the degree or association uh, or relationship between two or more variables or sets of scores. So these ideas have been expanded into more sophisticated interaction among variables, seen in approaches of structural equation modeling, hierarchical linear modeling, and logistic regressions. So more recently, quantitative tactics have entailed complex experiments with numerous variables and treatments. For example, factorial design and repeated measures design, collective. They have also included extensive structural equation modeling that contains causal routes and the identification of the collective strength of numerous variables. Rather than discuss all of these quantitative approaches, I will just focus on two designs, surveys and experiments. So, survey research provides a quantitative or numerical description of trends, attitudes, or opinions of a population by studying a sample of that group. It encompasses cross-sectional and longitudinal research using questionnaires or structured interviews for data collection. On the other hand, experimental research tries to determine if a certain treatment affects an outcome. Now, the researcher assesses this by administering specific therapy to one group and withholding it from another, for example, and then calculating how both groups scored on an outcome. Experiments include actual experiments with the random assignment of individuals to treatment condition and quasi-experiments that involve non-randomized assignments. Included within quasi-experiments are single-subject experiments too. And then we now move on to qualitative designs. In qualitative research, the 1990s and 21st century have also shown additional approaches. Qualitative research originated in anthropology, sociology, humanities, and even assessment. Now, books have simplified these types, and certain qualitative inquiry approaches include comprehensive methodologies. Humanities researchers use narrative research to study people's lives and asks them to tell their stories. The researcher often narrates this knowledge. The narratives often merges the researchers' and participants' perspectives. Philosophy and psychology, phenomenological studies, describe participants' real experiences of a phenomenon. This description summarizes various people's experiences with the phenomenon. This philosophical design usually incorporates interviews. Now, sociologists use grounded theories to develop a general, abstract theory of a process, activity, or interaction based on participant viewpoints. This approach uses many data gathering stages and refine and interrelates in information categories. Now, anthropology and sociology use ethnography to study the common behaviors, language, and acts of an intact cultural group in a natural setting throughout time. Data is collected through observation and interviews in ethnography. Lastly, we have case studies, where the researcher analyzes a case, usually a program, event, activity, process, or person in depth. Now, over time, researchers use various data gathering methods to gather extensive information about cases. And now let's move on to losses. No, it's only a joke. Now let's move on to mixed method designs. So mixed method research integrates qualitative and quantitative data. Now quantitative data like questionnaires or psychological tests is close-ended, while qualitative data is open-ended. Mixed method research has only been around since the mid-1980s. However, it is believed that it's a lot older than that. Early thinking regarding mixed methods was that all approaches had biases and flaws, and collecting quantitative and qualitative data neutralizes each form of data. So triangulating data sources to find qualitative and quantitative converge was invented. Now, by the early 1990s, mixed approaches converged quantitative and qualitative databases and integrated multiple study design. Now, a 2003 field manual fully covered these concepts. Um, Now, expanding mixed approaches involve one database might help explain the other database, and one database could investigate different types of topics than the other. One database might build on one other databases, and one database could alternate with another during a longitudinal research. The designs were produced and notated to assist readers understand them, but working with them presented complications. Today, practical issues such as an excellent mixed method studies and evaluating criteria, using a team and expanding mixed methods to other nations and disciplines are being considered. Now, the social sciences uses three mixed method models. Now, the researcher blends quantitative and qualitative data in convergent, parallel, mixed approaches to analyze the study challenge. In this design, the investigator collects two types of data at around the same time and integrates the information to interpret the results. The design investigates discrepancies. So explanatory sequential mixed techniques begin with quantitative research, analysis, and then qualitative research to explain the results. Qualitative data explains quantitative data outcomes, making it explanatory. The qualitative phase follows the quantitative phase, making it sequential. Now, this strategy is common in quantitative domains. Therefore, the project begins with quantitative research, but it offers issues of identifying quantitative outcomes to further explore and an equal sample size for each phase of the investigation. And then we have exploratory sequential mixed method. So it reverses explanatory sequential design. So exploratory sequential research begins with qualitative research and participant viewpoint. After data analysis, the quantitative step begins. The qualitative phase can be used to create an instrument that matches the sample, identify suitable instrument for the quantitative phase, or specify variables for the quantitative phase. This design's main hurdle are selecting qualitative findings and sample size for both phases. Lastly, we have advanced mixed method tactics or mixed method strategies, which employs these basic models, that of explanatory, exploratory, and convergent. Now, transformative mixed methods can take a theoretical lens from social justice or power to guide a quantitative and qualitative design. This investigation could converge or organize data consecutively. An embedded mixed methods design used either convergent or sequential data and embeds either quantitative or qualitative data into a broader design. For example, an experiment to support the design. Evaluation and program intervention often uses multi-phase mixed methodologies. For example, to understand a long-term program aim, this advanced design uses concurrent or sequential procedures throughout time. So the third most important part of the framework is the specific research methods. These are the ways that researchers plan to collect, analyze, and interpret data for their studies. As shown here, it's helpful to think about all these different ways to collect data and put them in order, such as by how much they are predetermined, as in quantitative and mixed method design, whether they use close-ended or open-ended questions, and whether they focus on numerical or non-numerical data analysis. Now, as the semester goes on, we will make these methods even more better. So, researchers um, use an instrument or test like a set of questions about how people feel about themselves, or a checklist or behaviors to gather information. For example, observation of a worker engaged in a complex task. On the other end of the spectrum, collecting data could involve going to a research site and watching how people act without asking any specific questions, or letting a person talk freely about the topic during an interview without asking many specific questions. The choice of methods depend on whether the goal is to know what kind of information will be gathered before the study, or to let it come out of the people who are taking part in the project. Also, the type of data that is analyzed could be numbers from scales or the voices of the people who took part, which were recorded and written down. Now, researchers can also try to figure out what the numbers mean, or what the themes or patterns are that come out of the data. In some types of research, both quantitative and qualitative data are collected, analyzed, and interpreted. Now, you can add open-ended observations to instrument data, or you can follow up census data with an in-depth exploratory interview. In this case, the researcher, as we have mentioned earlier, use both quantitative and qualitative database to draw conclusion. So now that we have talked about research approaches, their philosophical worldview, their research designs and method, I believe it's now time to put them all together. Okay, so um, yeah, based on the worldviews, designs, and methods, research tend to be quantitative, qualitative, or a mix of the two. Here, you can find uh, differences that might help you decide which way to go. So this table shows how each of these three approaches is used in the lessons that will follow. A typical research situation can show how these three parts come together to make a research design. Quantitative approach includes post-positivist worldview, experimental design, and pre-test and post-test measurements of attitudes. In this case, the researcher tests a theory by coming up with narrow hypotheses and gather data to prove or disprove them. Attitudes are measured before and after an experimental treatment using an experimental design. A tool that measures attitude is used to collect data, which is then analyzed using statistical methods and hypothesis testing. For qualitative research, or for qualitative approach, constructivist worldview is usually used. Following this, ethnographic design and observing behaviors are used too. So in this case, the researcher tries to figure out what the phenomenon means by asking participants what they think it means. This means finding a group of people who share the same culture and looking at how they develop similar patterns of behavior over time, which in this case is called ethnography. One of the most common important One of the most important parts of collecting data this way is watching how people act while they are doing activities. On the other hand, you can also use the qualitative approach and have transformative worldview, use narrative design, and open-ended interviews. So the person doing this study, for example, wants to look into a problem that has to do with people being mistreated. To study this, a narrative approach is used to collect stories of how people have been oppressed. People are talked to for a long time to find out how they have been oppressed in their own lives. The mixed methods approach take a pragmatic view of the world and collects both quantitative and qualitative data in a logical order. The researcher is asking these questions because he or she thinks that getting different kinds of data is the best way to get a fuller picture of a research problem than either quantitative or qualitative data alone. The study starts with a large survey so that the result can be applied to a population as a whole. The second part of the study focuses on qualitative, open-ended interviews with participants to get more detailed information that will help explain the first quantitative survey. So, uh, in conclusion, when planning a research project, researchers need to decide if they will use qualitative methods, quantitative methods, or a mixture of both. This method is based on combining a worldview or a set of assumptions about research with certain designs and research methods. The research problem or issue being studied, the researcher's personal experiences, and the audience for whom the researcher is writing can also affect the choice of an approach. So this ends our lesson on the selection of a research approach. Thank you for listening, and my name is Dex Kamitan.